The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and a warm welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl Martin. You are listening to the Mindful Medic podcast. A particularly warm welcome if you're joining us for the first time. So I'm delighted to welcome you back to another episode and introduce another wonderful guest. Some of you may know that for the past 12 months or so, I have been undertaking a Global Executive MBA at Melbourne Business School. And part of the great joy of that has been the opportunity to have a global learning experience. And last year, at the end of last year, I visited Hyderabad and the Indian School of Business. And that is where I met and was taught by today's guest. And there were a number of themes and teachings and areas of his work that really intrigued me and I really wanted to unpack in more detail, and I'm really delighted he agreed to come on the podcast today. So before we get into introducing him and to the details of today's podcast, let's hear from him.
In fact, interestingly, the more you automate a job, the more technology reshapes roles, the more the importance of the human connection, and the two have to sort of almost coexist. My grudge or grouse or complaint is that while the technology revolution has taken off, the human revolution is struggling to catch up.
So you just heard from today's wonderful guest, Professor Himanshu Tambe. Himanshu was my professor at business school when I visited the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. He is visiting faculty at the Singapore Management University and the Indian School of Business, teaching design of business, organisation design, leadership and workforce analytics. He also operates an early stage software product company focused on optimising operations. Prior to this, and as he discusses here, he has held several roles with Accenture Strategy Consulting, the last one being the Managing Director for the Talent and Organisation Consulting business in Southeast Asia and India. Before that, he worked for Arthur D. Little, the world's oldest consulting firm. Over a 30-year career in consulting and industry, he has proudly served more than 100 organisations across the public sector, metals and mining and banking in India, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, Australia and Europe. His work has been very much focused on designing and implementing business models, organisational design, process models and large-scale behaviour change to deliver measurable improvements in the performance of both people and organisation. Over this period, he has acquired deep experience facilitating senior executive teams to execute change through vision and values alignment. Outside of work, he is, like myself, an avid yoga practitioner and meditator, and he's currently learning jazz dance, which I didn't actually get a chance to talk to him about on the podcast. In this conversation, I particularly wanted to tap into his work and experience, not only in healthcare, but in other industries, with respect to the future of work and workforce and what he terms modern work, how we might harness and leverage emerging technology. But also, as alluded to in this opening quote, how we get back to the very fundamentals of meaning, purpose, and human connection in our work. Naturally, this brings us to a conversation about leadership and the future leadership that we need. I was listening to Himanshu on the ISB podcast a few months ago, and he was quoting Charles Handy, reminding us that what got us here won't keep us here and won't take us there. And this also reminds me of another of my business school professors, Professor Ian Williamson, telling us that the work has changed, the workers have changed, and the tools have changed. And so I think ultimately this conversation has more questions than answers and really encourages us to think about how we reimagine the work and reimagine the workforce. So without further ado, let's get into it. Today, I am delighted to welcome Professor Himanshu Tambe to the podcast. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for giving up your time. I think your expertise and insight, particularly on the future of work, workforce, and leadership, will be particularly relevant to this audience and valuable. Now, I know there's a couple of things that we said we were going to cover today. But just to begin, and by way of introduction and background, I'd love if you could tell my listeners a bit more about your own professional journey, background, which has taken you around the world, working, teaching, researching in the global business environment.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I don't know why, but over the last few months we've known each other, I feel a deep sense of connection. Not only to the way you think, but for the work that you're doing. So indeed, it's a privilege to be on. Thank you. Talking about a little bit about myself, I like to call myself a recovering consultant and an aspiring academic. So, I've spent, 30 plus years in one form of consulting or the other. I started my career as an engineer, an automobile engineer working on the shop floor. And then I went on to do a management degree. And I got into manufacturing consulting, because that was my background, and did a lot of operations research type of work in the initial days. And then I got into strategy consulting because I got a job with a company called Arthur D. Little. Some of your listeners might know, but it's the oldest consulting firm in the world. Started in 1886, I think, if I'm not wrong. And a lot of the big strategy firms today, the MBBs, as they call themselves, the McKinsey, Booz, Bain, etc., they are spin-offs of Arthur D. Little. And Arthur D. Little was very good at R&D consulting. And so I did that for a period of time. And that's when I got introduced to the idea of organization design and operating models and behavior change and things like that. And I got hooked onto that. I worked for a period in India, and then I moved to Singapore. Did a lot of work with corporates, especially in steel, metals, mining, oil and gas, the capital intensive organizations. But then slowly over a period of time, I found myself drifting towards the public sector, including health. And I think one of the reasons was because there was something inside me that was yearning to sort of create impact. And I found the way I could really create impact was to work with large public service organizations who in turn are working with citizens to improve the quality of service to them, to improve quality of life, and so on and so forth. So for a very large portion of my consulting life, I worked at the intersection of public service and workforce. Did a lot of work in organization design, in HR transformation, in workforce transformation. And then towards the kind of the second half of my career in consulting, I got this opportunity to set up from scratch analytics center of excellence for Accenture, which would serve our consulting operations globally. That was a phenomenal experience because it taught me what it is to sort of build an organization ground up, manage a P&L, build talent, work in distributed teams. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about today in terms of hybrid work and gig working and all that, I got exposed to this way back in early 2010s, even before COVID had happened. And so that was a lot of fun. And then throughout this period, for some reason, other than creating impact for my clients, who are mostly in public service, I was very taken up by the idea of helping others grow and create impact on individuals. And I did a bunch of things around coaching, but I really enjoyed teaching. And so I used to teach at the Accenture Corporate University. And slowly from there, I sort of gravitated into becoming a teaching assistant to a professor at Singapore Management University. I worked my way up through the academia route, taught finally a full course at Singapore Management University. And now I'm with the Indian School of Business, where we met, Cheryl. So I teach, I do both executive education as well as teach the MBA students. My subjects are across organization design, future of work, I call it modern work, and then consulting. So I've just come off a course on modern strategy consulting, and I had 140 students who signed up for it. So it was a fascinating experience. So sorry, a long answer to a very short question, but hopefully that gives you a tour of the countries and the kind of work I've done.
No, I mean, it's so impressive to me. And as someone who has sat in your classroom, and you really do bring a classroom alive, but you bring a wealth of expertise. And, I think it's that wanting to have impact, to add value, to see your students grow. I think that's where I have found a connection to you. So I'm really grateful to be able to have this conversation with you. And we said so for the beginning of this, we really wanted to talk about the future of work and workforce and really tap into your expertise on organizational design, strategic workforce planning, but particularly moving into the future and AI and data and how you actually might use and harness that to manage talent in the future. You've given, you mentioned there are some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of hybrid working persisting post-pandemic, the gig economy. And you've talked, I think the other context is this is not just in healthcare, we're seeing global shortages in many working environments in industry and a competition for talent. So I'd love you to start maybe generally some of the key trends that you see shaping the current and future work environment, and then we can maybe unpack a few of those. I know you've done some specific work in healthcare with Accenture.
Yep. Wonderful. No, absolutely. So I've been in researching this topic and teaching and even done some consulting in this area for the last, shall I say, 5-6 years. Yeah. And over a period of time, I've realized that talking about the future of work is a bit, I would say, sort of misleading, because what is the future? Isn't the future already here? So in the last couple of years, I've started talking about modern work, modern organizations, and modern leadership.
Nice.
So I actually created my own framework where I talk about how is modern work different from the work that happened even, let's say, 5-6 years ago. And I think I characterize it with two main things. One, of course, what technology has done and how it has reshaped roles. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And then the second big thing that has happened is the demographic shifts. And along with that, the workforce preferences. So let's talk about each one of them one at a time. And of course, of late, in the last, I would say, 3 years or 4 years, there's also the mega geopolitical shifts that are happening that have played its role as well. But let's take technology, right? There was a time when technology was considered to be replacing jobs, right? So it was the traditional technology in robotic process automation, robos themselves. So I would say the more traditional automation. But over a period of time, now we have, especially with generative AI, we are beginning to notice that it's not replacing, but it's beginning to augment.
Mm.
So the new mantra is human plus machine.
Yeah.
Where the machine at best augments the human intelligence. So take lots of examples, everything from how a contact center operator's life has changed, from no longer directing calls to actually solving problems, to a miner's job who no longer drives the fork shift at the coal face, but is sitting in a cabin and is looking at autonomous vehicles doing their job and managing them, to a retail worker who's no longer checking in customers, but is actually almost become like a fashion consultant in some cases, a personal shopper to the customers. So their jobs have changed, roles have changed. Unfortunately, our response has been inadequate, in my view, because our response has been take a job, look at all its tasks, go task by task, and look at what technology can replace it, and then put it back together and say, this is the new role. And I've done it myself. I made those mistakes myself, right? In my consulting career. In fact, for a healthcare organization, we looked at the role of a pharmacy technician. We looked at the role of the hospital receptionist. We looked at the role of the nurse, the emergency room nurse, et cetera, and we did exactly that. And guess what? Automation didn't work. Didn't give us the results. And looking back at it, I have two lessons learned. Lesson number one is we don't think about this as a system of roles. We think about it as one role at a time. So the fact of the matter is, if the pharmacy technician's role changes because of technology, it has a cascading impact on the nurse. So this human-to-human interaction in a system, we don't actually understand it enough. We don't acknowledge it well enough. So that's one problem. The other problem is within a role. And right now I was talking about a system of roles. But I would say even within a role, there are human-to-machine interactions. There are human-to-human interactions. After all, the tacit knowledge that you have, Cheryl, working over the number of years that you have in many, many different roles, or healthcare, largely, healthcare administration, I can't replace that tacit knowledge that you have. And some of that knowledge comes from how you interact with others. So I think in the area of modern work, sort of the work in progress, the thing that we haven't done well enough is redesign the roles. Acknowledging the interactions between roles and acknowledging that within a role, there are things that you do with other human beings. So the machine to machine, the machine to people interactions. So there's a lot to be done in that space. But be as it may, I think that's one big change in modern work. The other big change is simply the new generation that is entering the workforce or has already entered the workforce. Their preferences and for working in a remote setting. their preferences for how they interact with hierarchy and authority, their preferences on how they learn. Nothing like what it used to be when we were early in our careers. So this is shaping modern work in a big way, and that's what is leading to things like gig working, because I think over a period of time, the younger generation does not have loyalty to companies. They have loyalty to their profession, right? And so therefore, they're saying, why can't I be Cheryl Incorporated?
Yeah.
Why do I need to join hospital A, B, or C? Right? So these are the things like gig working, remote working, etc. I think to me have a deeper reason, and the deeper reason is what technology has done to jobs and what workforce preferences are doing to how jobs need to be shaped. But the big agenda, Cheryl, and I'll stop here, is rather than keeping on emphasizing on upskilling, reskilling, new skilling, corporates need to do more, organizations need to do more to redesign the roles. So a demand side push as opposed to simply a supply side interaction.
So there is so much that I want to dip into there. And some of those things I think we're going to focus on in the last part of the conversation. But just thinking about, particularly the redesigning of roles and leveraging emerging tech, human versus machine. I mean, I think one of the big challenges I see in medicine is, I think the increasing inefficiency of the technology we're currently dealing with. We still use the fax in hospitals, for example. That would be a big example of that. And the increasing paperwork, the administrative tasks. I think as a doctor, my focus is to try and get back to my patients and to deliver care. And I think that is what we're all wanting to do, but also seeing the whole system working more efficiently and in connection across community, across hospitals. And so I think there is a sense of, this is a really big task to change and to move forward. There is a lot of survival anxiety and the threat of having to change, but also the risk environment to do that. And so I know that you did a bit of work, particularly looking at the future ready healthcare workforce and redesign of care delivery. Was there anything you particularly wanted to highlight from that work in terms of implementation and the way forward?
Yeah. This was a piece of work we did for the Ministry of Health in Singapore, where they had actually tasked us to say, can you look ahead, look at the art of the possible in terms of all the technologies available, and tell us which of the roles in the healthcare system are going to get impacted the most, and what do we need to do to help our employees sort of match up to the new jobs. So one of the things we found was the more patient-facing the role was, the less were the possibilities of automating. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the nurse's role, the emergency room nurse, et cetera, et cetera. If I remember my numbers correctly, we found that barely 7 or 8% of the job.
I think general practitioners were the same, ICU nurses, all very low. Correct. I noticed increased for administrators, CEOs, certainly reception and tech roles.
And even pharmacy technicians and all of that, right? So that was one finding.
We're not going out of work anymore anytime soon. We need the human.
You need the human. So that was one very big realization, that the purpose of modern work should be on how do you deepen the human connection.
100%.
And so this has got two parts to it. One is take away the drudgery, but at the same time, work on the humans to increase the the empathy quotient, help these individuals realize the meaning in their work. In fact, interestingly, the more you automate a job, the more technology reshapes roles, the more the importance of the human connection, and the two have to sort of almost coexist. My grudge or grouse or complaint is that while the technology revolution has taken off, the human revolution is struggling to catch up.
Oh, so I'm going to just go here now because this is really a crux, and I think you started to touch on this when we were at ISB, and I really wanted to unpack this with you. I think this is where we do have a lot of common ground. I'm going to reference that HBR paper that I've spoken about quite a bit on the podcast. It was Associate Professor Mark Mortensen, who's done a lot of work on hybrid workforce, and Professor Amy Edmondson on rethinking the employee value proposition. And they have the 4 tenets of material offerings, the very basics, and opportunities for growth and development. But the other 2 core areas were, one, the meaning and purpose in work, and this building community and connection. And there's been a global workforce study across doctors and medical students. I think it was Elsevier that did it. And, it's still 90% of our workforce entering, that you talked about, that new emerging generation, the next generation of our workforce. Most of them are still entering medicine and nursing to add, they want to make a difference. Their purpose is there. They are very purpose driven. Yeah. My concern is that they are coming up against an environment that actually isn't allowing them to do what they actually set out to do. And some of the other things we're failing on the very basics of the actual material offerings. And so I'm scared that we're going to lose them in that environment.
Very true.
And you gave some really nice, I actually think this is our competitive advantage in healthcare. We're getting them with that, but we've got to sustain it. And I think when I was sitting in class, you gave a very nice example of, I think it was the train and transport workers in India. And I wonder if you could maybe share that with listeners, and any other examples that come to mind in terms of how you foster that.
No, I'm so glad you brought this up. I'm really, really passionate about this topic. I think over a period of time, because of the huge focus on the individual, we in the corporate world, in the organizational sphere, have lost the sense of the collective. And even look at the efforts we make even in change management or transformation. We are trying to transform one person at a time. Actually, what is needed is a transformation of the collective conscience of the organization, which means we need to understand what are the collective constructs, the mindsets that are blocking us from moving ahead. And so I have personally, post my consulting career, started working with a couple of organizations that have developed, I would say, a fairly interesting large-scale intervention technology to be able to bring this to the surface. Mm-hmm. And the philosophy is pretty simple. It's 3 concentric circles. At the outermost circle is the transactional reward. Yeah, so by transactional reward, I mean the extrinsic rewards. So salary, promotion, grade, bonus, whatever else, right? But the second layer inside that is what I call the contribution layer, which is each one of us in our jobs, and more so in healthcare, are contributing to someone else, something else. But the same is true for any citizen-facing service, which is why I'm so passionate about working in public service. You take railways, post, police. That was the one I was looking for. That's why I took some time to think it through. Police. Such hard jobs. So how do you motivate these people? Healthcare, such a hard job. These are extreme professions where people are working really, really hard to be of service. Uh, but unless you remind them that you're doing all this because there is a meaning, because you're contributing to someone else, uh, how do you motivate them? So to me, focus less on the extrinsic, focus on the intrinsic motivators of purpose, of meaning, of fulfillment, of contribution. So in fact, I wonder whether over a period of time we can move away from a performance management system to a contribution management system. Imagine if we could measure all of us, our employees, in terms of how much we contribute to others. So you'll move the narrative from getting to giving, right? And that will bring out the sense of fulfillment. And I think Amy Edmondson and the others talk a lot about psychological safety as well, and I'm sure you're going to come to that in a minute. But I think awakening meaning and purpose in work and building a sense of community is probably the next horizon for making meaningful interventions at the workplace. And there are technologies to do it. I mean, I'll share one example with you. You mentioned the trains, but let me take an example from the police. We were working with one of the police forces, and police in India doesn't have that great a reputation, right? They're considered to be rude, they're considered to be brusque, even corrupt, etc., etc. So we were in a workshop with these police officers, and we were asking them, but tell me why you do what you do, right? Why are you working? And so the initial answers were all around, oh, I get paid, salary, etc., etc. But when we dug deeper, they started sharing stories about how they saved lives, how they made a difference to a child who was trying to cross the road. And believe it or not, these are seasoned police officers. There were tears rolling down their cheeks. And we told them, I said, yes, of course, all that extrinsic stuff is important. You got to feed your family. But look at what you have done. And they were like, oh my God, I didn't even think of that. It's been buried somewhere very deep.
So this is the kind of more challenging question. There's been some work actually at the King's Fund, and I'm an emergency doctor, so I love a good ABC framework. And they've come up with, what we actually need in work is autonomy, belonging, and contribution. And I really like that. I think it's a bit kind of extrapolates from Dan Pink's autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Yeah.
I think the challenge that we have, and this probably brings in the redesign of roles, is that often in healthcare, our aspirations for providing that meaning, purpose, high quality, safe patient care can often fall short given the environment that we often find ourselves working in and the inadequacies associated with that, frequently overwhelmed, overburdened,
Yes.
actually sometimes contributing to harm. That I think there's a term that we're using increasingly. It really relates to the psychosocial hazards of those caring environments and moral injury. And so, I mean, again, this is a hard question, and I'm just, putting it out there, how do you harness redesign and automation? And again, I think there is inertia in environments where very much this is the way we've always done things. And you've done a bit of organizational change and behavioral change, and it's hard and it's slow. Starting that, and again, we're going to go on to talk about leadership. How do you start that? Where do you start in an organization?
Yeah. It's a good question. I used to, for a large part of my consulting career, I always thought leadership starts from the top. But over a period of time, I've done experiments both ways. Start, with the sponsorship of the leader. But I Sometimes it gets lost in translation as it goes down the layers. Then we have tried to start from the bottom, and that's been hard as well, for different set of reasons, right? So over a period of time, I've come to the realization that the layer that matters the most is the middle.
Yeah. Core leadership, the work unit leaders and managers.
Work unit leaders and managers. And I've, over a period of time, built an analogy in my mind that I love, and that's that of the hinge. So I think of these people as the hinge,
Nice.
because they're facing both inwards and upwards, and that's what's keeping the organization in place. They're the ones who need to be targeted. It's their mindsets that need to be changed. And one way to appeal to them is to help them see the meaning of their work. They're changing lives. Yes, exactly. Now, top leadership does have a role, as in not coming in the way. That's about the role that they have, and providing enablers. But change really happens middle out, in my view. That makes sense?
Perfect segue, because I heard you, and I'm going to reference it in the show notes, talking on the ISB podcast about leadership. And, you've mentioned a bit about Professor Amy Edmondson's work and a bit about hierarchy there. And, I think you've acknowledged that, it's difficult to seek consensus in crisis. But I really liked you kind of digging into that more deeply, talking about how you actually build psychological safety from a leadership perspective, moving from monitor to mentor, from command and control to communicate, collaborate, and coach. And it resonated very strongly with me. So I'd love you to unpack that a bit more.
Yeah. No. Again, thanks for asking that question. Again, a topic I'm very passionate about. So I've been working with a gentleman in Singapore, very fine coach, consultant. His name is Bill Cromwell. And he introduced me to the idea of third space. And third space is a metaphorical idea. He talks about it as a space in corporates, in organizations, in hospitals, wherever, where it's not your space or my space, it's an organizational space. And it's a space in which two things happen. One, the leader does whatever he or she needs to make the members of the team, the team, not feel like followers, but feel like team members, which means we are behaviorally equal. I will certainly have a little more authority than my team members, primarily because I have more information. And by the way, even that's breaking down, because with technology, information asymmetry is disappearing. And so the authority that I would exert on my team by virtue of having more information no longer holds. Right? But be as it may, I may have more authority, but behaviorally we are equal. So that's step one. That's moving from the first space to the second space. Step two is for the team members to step up and become what we call proactive self-leaders, which means I'm an equal stakeholder of success. I'm not an order taker. I proactively go up to my boss and say, what can I do differently to help you? So on and so forth. So the best example of it, Cheryl, interestingly, comes from the military, from the defense forces. Because when they go for an exercise, after they've done whatever they have to do, they come back and they do the after action review. I think you guys do it in healthcare as well. Yeah. And in that after action review, the general and his soldiers are all at the same level, as long as they're in that metaphorical third space. But how do you create that, overcoming the ego of the leader? How do you build a class of leaders who are not trapped in the power connotation of a hierarchy, but in the helpful connotation of a hierarchy? And I think the idea of contributions helps. So if I started measuring a leader based on what he has contributed to his team members or she has contributed, don't you think the behavior will change a little bit? I think it will.
How would you go about measuring that, and any other ways that you would measure good leadership?
Yes. I mean, for example, when I was in Accenture, one of the measures we had was how many people got promoted under my watch and eventually got accepted as partners. So the simplest thing is, how many leaders did I create?
Yeah. I had a beautiful conversation about this with my brother's partner, and she had someone that she had helped to, promote and develop and really mentor. And she talked about the day she came in to say she'd been offered a top job with a different company, and she was delighted for her because that's success. That's leadership success.
That's leadership. Unfortunately, we have not defined leadership that way. And I really wish there is a revolution in corporates, in leadership literature, where we start measuring people for their contributions to others. That'll make a big difference.
Have you seen any other great examples of really developing that core leadership? I don't like the term middle management, but I'm now moving towards this idea of core leadership, the work unit level, and I think a lot of the work that we've done in healthcare really supports that. That's where we need to invest, support, put our resources to develop leadership there.
Yes. So, towards the end of the last 7-8 years of my consulting career with Accenture, we started using an analytics platform for change called Change Track, which now is called Transformation GPS. And we used to use this to show in a very data-driven way, which again, by the way, is another pet hobby of mine or pet peeve of mine, that we need to become more data-driven in our conversations. So there we had used data to show that the people who can move things is this layer, whatever you want to call it. We used to call it the frozen middle. You got to unfreeze the frozen middle. And I saw people started buying into that. And instead of putting their developmental dollars only on the top and the senior part, they started moving it here. So more conversations, reminding them even more of how I've done this in the context of a shared service implementation. We were moving processes and work from different geographies into one central location. And it needed a complete change in mindset of the business leaders and of the frontliners. But we found that instead of attacking sort of the enterprise leadership, if he started working in the middle management, they in turn were able to influence their bosses. So I've done this a couple of times, and I'm convinced that, but the problem, I'll also tell you what the problem is, Cheryl. We don't have good enough technology for large-scale interventions. Because if you're dealing with this group of people, automatically you're not dealing in 5s and 10s. You're dealing in, hundreds, maybe thousands. So then how do you get to all of them in a consistent way? And so one of the organizations I'm working with right now, we are trying to do that. We're trying to create a technology platform that allows us to track in real time how these middle managers are first learning and secondly teaching.
How do you measure that and track that? How do you measure learning? Is that based on completed tasks or programs that they've completed?
So we're doing it at 2 levels. One is at the level of completed tasks, as you said, right? Have they conducted the number of sessions? Have they conducted it in time, et cetera, et cetera? And the other is behavior change. So we are beginning to measure change in behavior over a period of time.
So is that qualitative assessment?
it's actually we're quantifying that as well. So I give you an example. Um, One of the behaviors that we were trying to change is empowerment of teams as a part of a larger culture transformation effort. And one of the challenges we gave to the people was, hey, the meeting that you chair today, don't go for that meeting for the next 3 weeks. And let's see what happens to A, decision making, and secondly, the follow up on the decisions. So the person actually went through that challenge. They were, of course, very nervous, very resistant, but slowly they found out that not being at those meetings actually moved decisions faster.
That's interesting. Less meetings, more action.
Exactly. Less meeting, more action. So small things like that. There is a way to measure behaviors. Um, of course, it's about finding a proxy to a qualitative, because behaviors by nature are qualitative, right? But so I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, they're getting that feedback that's often missing.
Yeah, exactly. More frequent.
The other thing that we haven't touched on that I just kind of come to mind when I'm thinking about this, creating community and connection amidst the workforce in a setting of increasing part-time, flexible, hybrid working. You seen any work or examples of addressing that challenge? Because I think that is something that, on one hand, we're trying to create more connection, but we're also getting people actually present and connected.
Yeah. So to be honest, there's a lot of work to do in that space. Although I now see some organizations starting to treat the extended workforce as a part of the organization. So a first step in that direction is, at least now, HR considers the extended workforce a part of the workforce. So deals with them the same way. I would say when I was in Singapore, Grab was trying to do that with their ride hailers service and with their food delivery service, trying to bring them into the organization to start with, treating them similarly to full-time employees, and then trying to help them understand what difference they make in the lives of the people who they deliver food to. It's not just a transaction of dropping off a food packet, but it may be someone who has ordered a meal to feed a child, and the child may go hungry if you don't reach it in time, kind of a thing. But by and large, organizations they lead from a place of this being a cost strategy. As long as they do that, they're not going to invest.
And that's what I liked about your Accenture work, because you actually thought, well, where is the return on investment here if we automate some of these roles and change them? I suppose a lot of it is what are the costs of doing nothing, and what are the savings if we change?
That's right. Yeah.
It's hard because you sometimes deal with tangibles and
it's really hard. It's really hard. Another one that I was privy to recently was at the sales force. So these guys had sales associates. This is a paint organization, and they had associates who were running the dealerships. And there was again a large scale intervention. We're talking about, I don't know, thousands of dealerships across the country, and these dealer associates were traditionally always considered on the periphery of the organization. But this time around, they brought them in and said that, look, the work you do is not just selling a can of paint, but you're helping a person beautify their home. And that changed the entire dynamic. These guys started taking ownership.
One of the companies we visited in Germany was a manufacturing pharmaceutical company. And again, like everywhere, global competition for talent, increasingly difficult to attract and retain. And, they had a couple of value propositions that I thought was really good: early responsiveness, internships. But part of that was bringing in the clinicians who were prescribing the medications in palliative care, for example, or one of the patients who had used the medication to talk about their illness. And I thought that was a really powerful way to
Okay.
connect people who are on the tools or in the manufacturing plant to what they're actually producing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um,
Great. Good example.
oh, that was,
Wonderful.
yeah. Um, there are so many other things that I'd like to mention, but we've only got 10 or 12 minutes left, and I'm conscious of your time and I want to respect it. I always ask, just before we go on to the closing questions, is there anything else on this topic that we haven't covered that you think is important for this audience? Again, it's an extended audience now, not
Yeah.
just healthcare.
Right. I think the one thing that we don't talk about enough, and it's sort of important for all the other things we talked about, like psychological safety or helping people find meaning and purpose in their work, etc., is how do you decouple fear and failure, right? How do you and this is something that it's not my line. This is Ed Catmull. He was the CEO of Pixar. It's his line. How do you decouple fear and failure? And his whole point is, if you're not able to help people understand that the failure is not the end of the world, that failure is not a badge of honor that you have to carry for the rest of your life, you will never get the creative best of people. And people will only start looking after themselves. And there is no question of them contributing to others or creating a sense of community or even helping them find meaning in work. So I think I buy that. I think I buy that because I've seen it happening at workplace. When there is the fear that if I don't get the credits for the sales that I have done, then it drives very toxic behaviors. To the extent that I've seen in organizations that there was a underground barter trade on sales credits. Can you imagine what that does? So how do we do that? How do we make sure that failure does not mean that you're castigated for life somehow or the other? And there's no easy route to that, because on the one hand, you want to also create a performance orientation. On the other hand, you don't want people to start sort of getting so worried about failure that it leads to toxic behaviors.
Or silence. And I think what we see in healthcare, particularly in junior nursing and medical staff, they fear they fear mistakes, and we work in perfect systems, and failure.
Yeah, and I think in healthcare, if people don't speak up, I guess it's everywhere, but imagine in healthcare what the consequences are if people don't speak up, don't admit to. So this is one problem, right? I used to always say this during my consulting career, that don't first of all, don't bring me good news only. I want to hear the bad news. And secondly, don't bring me the bad news when it is too late, because then I can't do anything. The train's left the station. So how do you encourage people to give you bad news? Because everyone wants to look good. So they want to come to you with solutions.
Have you led, I think there's a couple of things you've mentioned there. It's Linda Hill's Collective Genius.
Yes.
I think she's got some great examples of that. And I can't remember, she did talk about Pixar and the pitch parties. And, people don't take if their pitch is not successful as I am the failure. It's the idea that's not the success. It's not personally. But there was another one where she talked about a new CEO taking on a role and asking the managers to come with, really with problems. And nobody wanted to do that because the previous culture was you do not talk about the things literally took, a couple of weeks of these meetings and nobody had anything for him. And then finally somebody said, presented one red slide. I think he had a traffic light system. Green is we're all good, amber we're struggling, red, I'm really struggling with this. And somebody finally had an amber slide and then a red slide. And he was like, now this is great. Can anybody help him with this? And then it started this conversation.
Lovely.
And people were like, oh, he's going to be fired next week.
Right.
And then it started this cascade of people actually then be able to talk about the things they're failing at, the things that they're struggling with, and coming together to problem solve.
Wonderful.
How do you do that though? I mean, these are great examples, and I'm always thinking then how you do that in your own environment.
Yeah. And some of it is also it's not just the culture of the organization, it's also the country culture.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's the national culture also that plays a role. Anyway.
So I would love to finish this off. And again, I think I'm really excited to talk a little bit about this with you, because I know we've touched on it, and talk about what you're doing next. But I call this the personal prescription. And this podcast does have an emphasis not only on well-being at work, but also our individual and personal well-being, and how we sustain ourselves professionally and personally. What does well-being mean to you at this time?
It's a very, very relevant question, and something that's dear to my heart, because I worked in a very extreme profession for 30 plus years, and it took a toll on my physical health and it took a toll on my mental health. And I came out of fairly low points in both physical and mentally. And I've learned over a period of time that you need to build your own happiness architecture.
Nice.
And your happiness architecture is not the same as someone else's. And it took me a long time. It actually needed professional help. I had to go to a therapist to get some help, to be able to then figure out what my prescription is. And to me, it's got three parts, right? One is if I'm not doing meaningful work, I cannot get myself to work. And so, therefore, I do what I do. Teaching is one way for me to fulfill my mission. I think about it as, yes, of course, it's a way of earning money, but more importantly, it's a way of serving others. So the second thing is very good, deep relationships. And I must say, I was guilty of ignoring relationships, friends, family, extended family. And in the last 5 years, I've reconnected with everyone. And that has made such a big difference. I at least pick up the phone and I speak to friends, I speak to family, I make it a point, specific, especially on weekends, right? And then the third one is a lot more of focus on mental and physical health, especially the connection between mental and physical health. And the way I've done it is I have a very elaborate morning ritual. From the time I get up to the time I take my first call, it takes me 3 hours. And this is a guy who used to get out of bed, go into the shower, and go straight for a meeting. But now I do my yoga, I do my meditation, I do a little bit of reading, I read the papers leisurely, I make a couple of calls to cousins or friends or whatever, and then I start. And the days I don't get a chance to do that, I'm not myself. So that's a very specific thing that I've done. And I think I started reading on spirituality, not religion, spirituality. And that's helped me a lot. That's brought a lot of peace to me personally.
So two questions. I mean, I think there's important lessons for all of us there. Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned that morning ritual. Is that founded in Ayurveda? Because I know we both have an interest there. And also, yes, on those spiritual readings, anything in particular that you read recently you might recommend?
So yes, I've been reading. But this is not new. He's been this has been around for a very, very long time. But this whole thing on Vedanta, it's Swami Vivekananda was the gentleman who first brought it to the West. It's based on the Eastern scriptures, but I think he's made it more practical. In fact, he has a book called The Practical Vedanta, which is what I'm reading right now.
Write that down for me.
Yeah, I'll put it on the chat if you like. Practical Vedanta. It's really good.
Great. So finally, and I think you've just given me some of those, some of the things that you might involve. We have a thing on the podcast called the Self-Care Sunday, and you did mention weekends. If you were to design a self-care Sunday for yourself, what would it involve?
Okay. It would have at least a few important components. One, a massage, an Ayurveda massage. So I go to one of these places. I have a regular arrangement with them. I go there. Definitely meeting some friends, right? And I'm fortunate now. I'm in the city from where I studied, so I have a lot of my old school network and friends here. What else? Last couple of hours of a Sunday I always reserve to prepare for the week. So because it's very important to me to feel prepared. It gives me a lot of peace of mind, and I figured it's worth putting in that effort. So some of those things.
The home of the American cuisine. I really miss the idli and the roti.
Yeah. Welcome back. You should actually come, this time on a professional trip.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. It was a wonderful experience talking to you, Cheryl, and I look forward to staying in touch.
You have been listening to the Mindful Medic podcast with Professor Himanshu Tambe. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a colleague. Please take time to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us grow this community and listenership. I will put a link in the show notes to the ISB podcast and the conversation with Professor Tambe. It's another one I really recommend. Also, if you are listening to this episode just as it drops, some of you may be attending the Digital Health Festival in Melbourne, May 7th and 8th next week. And looking at the programme, some of the themes we visit today are going to be up front and centre in the content for the DHF. So I hope to see some of you there. Finally, for any budding clinician innovators who are listening, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to an opportunity for a 12-week accelerator program that is being launched as a collaboration between the Creative Careers in Medicine team, who many of you are familiar with and have heard me speak about on the podcast, and the Medical Angels Group. So for any budding clinician innovators listening, you can find out more information about that program in the show notes. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and I look forward to joining you with more great guests and great content next time. Till then, goodbye.
I can't replace that tacit knowledge that you have. And some of that knowledge comes from how you interact with others. So I think in the area of modern work, sort of the work in progress, the thing that we haven't done well enough is redesign the roles.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are at this very minute experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.